There is a handout, and I'm going to talk basically through the handout. And my focus is going to be on the poem itself, the poetic genius of the song. So skipping the first few little bullet points of interest, I'd like to start with the poet's aim as I see it, which is to immortalize a vision of love as ongoing, never-ending, strong as death. The proof that love is strong as death is the poem itself, a lasting testimony to the poet's vision of love, addressed to its readers throughout time, and preserved for us thanks to its inclusion in the Bible, the circumstances of which we know little. Real lovers die, but the love that is celebrated here lives on so long as the poem is read. So what makes the song a great love poem? Its poetic genius lies in the way the poet shows us, as well as tells us in chapter 8, that love is strong as death, and in the way the poet explores the nature of love by looking at love from both a woman's and a man's point of view. How does the poet show us and not simply tell us that love is strong as death? First and foremost, by showing us love as already, always in progress. The song presents us with a vision of love not in the abstract, but in the concrete, through showing us what lovers do, or more precisely, by telling us what lovers say. Through the exclusive use of direct speech, the poet creates an illusion of immediacy. Voices of lovers seem to reach us directly, unmediated. But this is an illusion, for the voices are created for us by the poet. By presenting the lovers in the act of addressing each other, the poem gives us the impression that we are overhearing them and watching their love as it unfolds. If you'll take a look at the handout, the back of the handout, chapters 2, 8 to 17, the woman presents a vivid picture of her lover as he comes courting. Listen and look. Focus attention on the action in progress before us. The present moment is vividly captured by participles. The man is approaching, bounding over hills, standing, looking, his activity arrested in time and space. Another way the poet immortalizes love is through conjuring. By conjuring, I refer to the way that through seductively beautiful poetry, the lovers materialize and dematerialize, come into being and disappear in a continual play of seeking and finding. Conjuring seeks to make present through language what is absent, the lovers. There aren't any real lovers, only a poem about lovers. By means of conjuring, the poet brings them to life on the page before us. In the verses we just looked at, the woman conjures her lover up as a suitor coming to court her, and she brings him closer and closer until there he is. The man conjures his lover up repeatedly by describing her in densely metaphorical language until she materializes before us, a body clothed in metaphor. If you look at 4, 1 to 5 on the handout again, notice how the man builds up a picture of the woman part by part, how the poet conjures her up through language. Her eyes like doves in verse 1, her hair like a flock of goats winding down Mount Gilead, her teeth, verse 2, white like newly washed sheep and evenly paired. In verse 3, red lips and a lovely mouth, cheeks behind her veil like a slice of pomegranate, and in verse 4, her neck like a tower adorned with shields. The invitation to the reader. For the poet's vision of love to live on, the poem must be read. It needs us, its readers, in order to be actualized in the here and now, in the acts of reading and of appreciation. Indeed, having an audience is so important that the poet provides one within the text itself. In addition to the voices of the lovers, there is a third speaking voice, that of the women of Jerusalem. These women function as an audience, and their presence facilitates the reader's entry into the lover's seemingly private world of erotic intimacy. The women of Jerusalem are especially important because for readers, there is, I think, a certain element of voyeurism involved in overhearing the intimate exchanges of lovers. Just try to imagine the Song of Songs without the women of Jerusalem. Presenting the lovers as aware of and in conversation with an audience is a poetic strategy that makes the relationship between the lovers less private, less closed, and the song less voyeuristic. The women's presence is always a reminder that what seems to be a closed dialogue between lovers is addressed to us, the readers. By presenting the lovers as representing all lovers, the poet encourages readers to identify with them. By providing access to only the voices of the lovers, to what they say, not who they are, the poet is able to identify them with all lovers. This, in turn, makes it easier for readers to relate the lover's experience of love to their own experience, real or fantasized. This strategy has been very successful, as can be seen in the way readers over the centuries have responded to the vision of love they find here, as a description of human love, or divine love, or both. I doubt that the allegorical interpretation, which was the dominant approach to the song for centuries, would have been so widespread and so influential if the poem were about specific lovers of the past, say Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Blurring distinctions between anticipation and enjoyment of love. In the song, desire is always on the brink of fulfillment. It has an urgency about it. Come, tell me, make haste. There are lots of imperatives. Fulfillment is simultaneously assured, deferred, and on a figurative level, enjoyed. There is assurance because love is mutual. Each seeks the other, and there is never any doubt about their mutual desire and devotion. There's no he loves me not. For the song, there is only my lover is mine and I am his. Fulfillment may be deferred. For example, the woman invites her beloved to come out to the countryside where she will give him her love. But this is something yet to take place. He takes her to the house of wine. She brings him to her mother's chamber. But do they consummate their love there or anywhere in the poem? Yes, on the figurative level, sexual union is represented in the poem through the indirection of language, through innuendo, double entendre, and metaphor. The man is an apple tree whose fruit is sweet to his lover's taste. The woman is a lily and a garden, and her beloved goes down to his garden to feed among the lilies. If you take a look again at the text of 2:8-17 on the handout, notice how it begins in the present, with the woman drawing our attention to what is happening. Listen, look, he's coming. But then in verse 10, the woman, as narrator of this story, speaks in the past tense about these events. My lover answered and said to me. Then she quotes her lover, and he seems to be speaking in the present. In verse 17, she addresses him directly. Turn, my love, be like a gazelle. Are these words she spoke to him in the context of the visit she's narrating, or is she speaking to him now in the present? Significantly, there is no closure to this poem about desire. The concluding verses of the song have perplexed and often disappointed commentators, and they're on the handout, chapter 8, verses 13-14. To object, as some scholars do, that the ending is abrupt, or an odd way to end a poem, or a peculiar ending for a love song, is to fail to recognize what the poet is trying to show us about love. The song's resistance to closure, its refusal to reach what we might call an end, is perhaps its most important means of immortalizing love. Closure would mean the end of desiring, the silence of the text, the death of love. Resistance to closure is an attempt to keep love always in progress on the page before us. Not only does the song end without closure, it begins in medias res, let him kiss me. This design, in effect, makes the song a poem without a clear beginning or end. Like the love it celebrates, the Song of Songs seeks to be ongoing, never-ending, always in progress. As an analogy, think of the lovers in John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. They're forever loving, forever fair, forever on the brink of attaining their bliss. Where does the urn's story begin and end? We could name a particular point as the beginning, but the movement circles around upon itself. So even if we perceive an end to the activity portrayed on the urn, it begins again where it left off. So we might think of the Song of Songs as a verbal Grecian urn. I turn now to this second aspect of the poem's genius, exploring love from a woman's and a man's point of view. There are only three clearly identifiable speaking voices in the song, a man's, a woman's, and a group of women called Daughters of Jerusalem. The women of Jerusalem have only a few speeches. Most of the speeches belong to a female voice and a male voice. The song offers no clue that these male and female speaking voices belong to different men and women. Although, as I said earlier, the lovers have multiple personalities, that is, they are representatives of all lovers rather than identifiable individuals, they nevertheless seem to take on distinct personalities as we get to know them. They are consistent in the way they each talk about love and in the way love makes them behave. And this encourages us to feel we know them and enables us to build a picture of them. The dialogue format of the song serves two functions. It enables the poet to create the impression of immediacy that makes the lovers seem to come to life on the page before us, and it allows the poet to explore the nature of love and longing from both a woman's and a man's point of view. On the one hand, the female and male voices are in harmony, both desirous and both rejoicing in the pleasures of sexual intimacy. On the other hand, the poet has given the lovers distinct perspectives. There are differences in emphasis in the way the male and female lover talk about love. They do not look at love or at each other in quite the same way. She expresses her desire and explores her feelings for him and his for her through stories in which she and he are characters. They both play roles as themselves or in fantasy guises, for example, when they imagine each other as shepherds or royal figures. Her stories are the only parts of the song that display narrative development, or what we might call a plot. For example, she tells two stories in which her lover comes courting. 2:8-17 on your handout is one of these stories in which he invites her to join him outside to enjoy the springtime. In her other story, he wants to join her inside at night. That's chapter 5. Twice, she recounts how she goes out in the city streets searching for him. The first time, she is immediately successful in finding him. The second, she encounters a distressing setback before achieving her goal. The man does not tell stories. He has a different way of talking about love. He looks at her, invites her to look at herself through his eyes, tells her what he sees and how it affects him. In the examples on your handout, he describes what he sees metaphorically and its effect on him. He finds her awesome. These texts are on the back sheet. You are beautiful, my friend, like Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, as awesome in splendor as they. And when her gaze meets his, he is overwhelmed. Turn your eyes away from me, for they overwhelm me. The lovers describe differently what it is like to be in love. And these texts are also on the handout. The difference is subtle, for both feel wondrously overwhelmed by the other. The woman tells others, the women of Jerusalem, about being in love and how she experiences it. I am faint with love, or I am lovesick. The man thinks in terms of conquest, of power relations. You have captured my heart. Unlike the woman who describes how she feels, he does not say, "I am overwhelmed," but rather describes the way he feels as something she has done to him. "You have captured my heart. Turn your eyes away from me, for they overwhelm me." He is awestruck. "You are beautiful, my friend, like Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, as awesome in splendor as they." There are differences in the way they describe each other's body. The man pictures the woman's body part by part with a striking simile or metaphor for each part 3 times, twice from her head downwards, though he stops midway, and once from her feet to her head. She describes his body in a similar fashion from head to foot, only once. But the fact that she also gazes at his body is extremely important. For if only the man looked, there would be a serious gender imbalance in the song, and I think it would be voyeuristic. An important difference is that unlike his descriptions of her, she is not looking at him when she pictures his body. She describes him in answer to a question raised by the women of Jerusalem: "What distinguishes your lover from other lovers?" His descriptions, in contrast, are represented by the poet as spontaneous outbursts inspired by the sight of her. He addresses her as "you," whereas she speaks of him as "he" when she describes him to the women of Jerusalem. His imagery is more vivid or more picturesque than hers. Hers is more relational than his. The differences in the way the poet portrays the female and male lovers reveal the poet's remarkable sensitivity to differences between women and men. Obviously, these differences reflect cultural assumptions about gender differences and roles, which is not to say the poem does not challenge certain of these assumptions as well, for one cannot but be impressed by the mutuality in the song. And since I believe my time is up now, I'd just like to conclude with an observation that the very features that make the song a great love poem also enable it to be easily interpreted in many different ways. Its universality, its timelessness, the lovers as representatives of all lovers, the invitation to the reader to participate in the vision of love we find here, the impression of love unfolding as we read, its ongoing quality. These features make it easy to read the song in terms of divine lovers, a god and goddess, human lovers, heterosexual love, homosexual love, spiritual love, pornography, the love between God and Israel, Christ and the church, the individual believer and God, and so on. As Francis Landy says, we find ourselves written here.
Well, I'm also delighted to be here, and I particularly want to give thanks to Professor Clooney and also to my colleagues. I've learned so much in the last couple of days. As mentioned to Stephanie as we were going out, it's a great joy to be around people who are saturated with the Song of Songs, and it's in their ear, in their eye, in their bodies, and this has been a great pleasure. It's also a great pleasure to follow Cheryl, because I've learned so much from your commentaries, and as you heard from her presentation, how alert she is to sound and gender and voice and so on. I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about what it means to write a commentary on the Song of Songs, particularly a song of love, and particularly to try to do so where the song has been a continuous source of spiritual and intellectual instruction in the Jewish community, and to try to write a commentary that in fact is a spiritual exercise for the reader. So let me say a few words first about the task of the commentator, and then a few words about the way I've constructed the commentary to try to produce a spiritual exercise and create the immediacy of religious reading, not just information, but that the commentary, in fact, is transformative experience. Every reader is a commentator, but commentators are readers in a special sense, particularly those who comment on canonical books. Why is this so? because commentators must subordinate their voice to the voice of the text and be formed or informed by its content. This position of subordination is the position of hearing, of humility, and of secondariness. And when one is a latecomer, one is also the recipient of thousands of years of prior devoted commentaries, detailed comments, and detailed learning and comments on the text. This is surely the position of a commentator on Scripture. But the commentator is also a voice in his or her own right. And this involves something different. It involves a corresponding insubordination, a rupture of the sequence of the text that's been given, the arrogance of primariness, of inserting one's voice into the voice of the text. There's an intervention of the human voice for the sake of the voice that's been heard. For the commentator, every resaying is a new saying that asserts that mediation, paradoxically, is a form of being immediate. The I voice of the commentator arrogates to itself that its form of mediation will create immediacy. I'm even in a more impossible situation. The Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, has been interpreted for 2,000 years with every level of commentary: philological, stylistic, midrashic, which is to say rabbinic theological, philosophical, allegory, and mystical interpretation, right down to our own day. These four ways have been distinguished in the history of Jewish commentary, which I think isolate 4 levels of religious experience, 4 levels of being a human being. And each of those 4 levels are represented at different levels of genre and produce different kinds of comments. The most primary level, the level of pshat in rabbinic language, or plain or contextual sense, is the sphere of natural love, of ourselves as people with ordinary desires and bodies and urges and approach and seeking and hiding and strange ruptures in desire that happen. That kind of love is parsed word by word, feature by feature, gap by gap, and the commentators try to deal with that. But we're more than simply creatures of natural bodies. The rabbis immediately understood that love is more than a natural love. Love is communal love, covenantal love. One loves within the framework of a religious community. And so one loves and seeks God through the forms and language of the community. And the task of the interpreter is not simply to interpret the natural desires in speech as they occur in the song, but as they cultivate a religious devotion, as they cultivate the study of Torah, as they put one into the covenant, as they celebrate the great things that Jewish religious life seeks to celebrate. And that's the level of drash. There's a third level. A person is not only a natural being, and not only a communal being in a religious community and loving God through the language of communal language, but a person is a self-seeker. People seek God through other forms. And this form is represented by the philosophical allegory of the rabbinic tradition, what's called remez, which is to say, there are exercises to cultivate desire, to reframe desire, to focus mind, to focus the heart. And one does that in a personal way. The goal of love or the goal of redemption is not national or communal or within a synagogue setting. It takes place in the spiritual center of one's own heart and mind. This is eros and quest, seeking, It doesn't lose the framework of the communal, but it has its own language, its own syntax, its own form of commentary. And the fourth level, called Sod, or the mystical level, is that we're more than those three levels as well. We live and born and die into the depths of God. The fourth level is the cosmic level. It's the level which is the internal pulse of love of God to God, of God seeking God and God, the rhythms of God itself in which we're only ciphers. And to find the place of the soul and the mind and the culture in that back and forthness of the maleness and femaleness, insofar as the song is understood in gender terms, is to understand oneself within the love of God for God's self. This is all the more perplexing for the commentator because the Song of Songs has depths before the song. And one has to take account of Egyptian and Mesopotamian and even Hellenistic love lyrics. One has to see how one talks about love, the metaphors of love. So there's a prehistory to love, there's the love in the song, and then there's the reception or the Nachleben, the ongoing ways that one learns how to love by meditating on the Song of Songs. In my commentary, I want to be responsible for all four levels, but that's precisely because we live at all four levels, at the natural and the communal and the personal and the cosmic. So I have to find a way to write a commentary that retrieves the totality of rabbinic interpretation, which is fourfold, but also does that to enliven those states of consciousness and experience. So let me just mention through three key terms how I'm trying to do that. One is format. So what I've chosen to do is that every verse will be placed in the center of the text, and each of the four levels of commentary will be placed around it in a rabbinic form. So there will be multiple commentaries as they circulate around the text. What does that do? It refuses to allow the text to be hierarchized or any one reading to be privileged. It means that the reader has to enter into the synergy and the dynamics of interpretation. The reader will choose under certain circumstances how you move between the plain sense and the communal sense or the personal sense, or not at all. And that means that the reader has to become an interpreter on their own terms. So there's an intersection, a synergistic intersection. It means that there's a plurality of religious life and there's a plurality of commentaries. And that the reader, who reads the commentary, has to enter in the same interventionist way to allow the text and the comments to fill themselves and grow. So the first term is form. The second, playing on that, is the formulation. What I mean by that is I found very quickly that if I was simply to give each of those four levels, I would only be producing basic information. It would be like a commentary as a Rolodex. So you can just sort of flip through and find out what the rabbi said, what the midrash said, and it's meaningless. People don't live at the level of the active or acquired intellect, and people don't live at the level of theosophy or certain forms of mystical language. So at this level of formulation, the first level of the commentator is to be absolutely saturated and filled with every single comment that's been given in the entire 2,000 years of the tradition, but then do something else, to reformulate that in a modern theological language. And to make the choices, one is always making choices, to create certain kinds of dialectics so that the reader also doesn't realize that that particular interpretation is the only interpretation possible, even at that particular level. The reader is constantly forced to enter into a multiplicity and to learn to think theologically and religiously, because the commentator is willing to take the risk to reformulate that language back into a theological language that makes living sense. So first is form, second is formulation, and the third would then be transformation. What I mean, and here I'm influenced by the language of Franz Rosenzweig, that the goal is to give the reader innere Kraft, a kind of inner power. It's to empower the reader to become a religious reader. That each of the verses become prisms. There is a kind of prismatic quality to each one of the particular verses. Hopefully, the reader will realize that there's also a certain kind of religious strategy in placing all of the commentaries in correlation with one another. And that's something that was already commented on 13th century medieval commentaries. I'm thinking of people like Ibn Aqnin and others. And that is to say that natural desire, we begin with natural desire, but it's thickened, transformed, spiritualized, and reworked. You never escape the natural, but the natural moves to the communal, to the personal, to the divine. And then from the other side, of course, when one is at that cosmic level, one doesn't float off into some kind of supernal level, but one is always back into one's physicality and one's naturalness. So there's a movement back and forth. Each verse then becomes a meditative unit. There is the kind of, in the Catholic tradition, there is a kind of lectio divina. One is always reading verse by verse. In this case, writing a commentary is to create a meditative sequence, verse by verse, so each verse becomes a prism of entering into this. I'll close with two more points, and that is that if the commentary works in terms of the prismatics of the verse and the synergistic qualities of the reading and the overlay of a modern language, we would have what always was when people wrote religious commentaries or commentaries designed for the soul. It would be a new form of theology. It would be a way of living theology through verses, through interiorizing verses and their multiplicity. This was the way theology always was, even apart from the fact that theology might have become systematic and organized. But it has to become that again, particularly for the modern reader who is filled with these disjunctions and these movements and the multiplicity. So there's a meditative weight for each verse, and then one moves to the disjunctions of verse by verse. That's the first point, is to create a new form of theology. The second point is to create a new form of religious self. The self that's a kind of palimpsest. The self that's informed in the most literal sense by texts. That the self is a layered self through tradition. The self that's not a layer, or anything else that one is reading. To create this layering of self slowly, assiduously, and in all kinds of ways. And to become aware of oneself and have access to these depths of the tradition. My goal as a commentator, then, is to try to bestow a new form of religious personhood by my mediation of the commentary of the Song of Songs. So the Song of Songs is itself a work that I've tried to live with as a form of spiritual exercise. And the only gift that a commentator can do is to hope to return this as a spiritual exercise for the enhancement of the religious self of the reader. Thank you.
Well, I too am very grateful to be here. I've learned a great deal this past day and a half, and expect to learn more tomorrow. Especially grateful to Frank Clooney and Stephanie Paulsell, both of them old friends, for the invitation to be here. There's a handout that I passed around as well, just one side of the paper. I'll make occasional reference to that. But before I get to that, 3, maybe 4 brief preliminary points. I want to talk about the experience of reading the Song of Songs in 3 different ways. First of all, reading it naked, as it were, without helps or aids. Second, reading it, we might say, lightly clothed as a book of scripture. And third, reading it gorgeously arrayed in its full dress, which means within a particular tradition of reading. And in the case I'm speaking of, that's the Catholic tradition. Of course, that's not the only one. So that will be the framework for what I'm going to say. Preliminarily, the Song of Songs, it's important to be aware, is at least between the 3rd and 15th century or so, the book of scripture that within the Christian world prompted the most commentary by a long way, word by word. It's a very short book, much shorter than most other books, but if you assess the number of words in it compared to the sheer volume of commentary prompted by it, the Song of Songs wins hands down over any other book of scripture. Since the 15th century, that situation has dramatically changed in both the Protestant and the Catholic world. It's now one of the least commented books on scripture, or has been for a while. This may now be changing. Everyone seems to be writing commentaries on the Song of Songs. So there's a historical transition of important kind that's linked to liturgical changes, and I'll say a few words about that at the end. Second, although the Song of Songs has receded somewhat as an object of scriptural commentary in the Christian world anyway, it's remained constantly provocative of poetical and artistic and other sorts of responses, both within and outside the Christian ecclesial world. And on the handout, just as an instance of that, the third brief extract toward the top there is from a contemporary Irish poet who's written a number of poems about the Song of Songs. I won't attempt to pronounce his name. Those who have better Gaelic than I do will have a go at that. But I simply include that, both because it's beautiful, but as an instance of the constantly provocative nature of this short text outside the ecclesial world as well as within it. Third preliminary point would be that the Song of Songs contains a more concentrated, dense, and intense depiction of human flesh and its possibilities than is found anywhere else in Scripture. And that's one of the important things that I want to return to in just a moment. Keep that in mind. The grammar of the flesh, understanding what the flesh is, how it works, what its various parts are for, is found most fully in the Song of Songs anywhere else in Scripture. Fourthly and finally, by way of preliminaries, in the year AD 398, Jerome made a Latin version of the Song of Songs, probably in one day, though we're not quite sure about that, but certainly in a brief period of time. He had before him, we don't exactly know what, but he had before him certainly a version of the Hebrew text, at least two versions in Greek, and some old Latin versions. And from that, he made a version of the Song of Songs which entered into the Latin canon that came to have the name the Vulgate. And that version, that Latin version, was for the Christian world from the 5th century until the Reformation anyway, the text. So if one wants to look at the Christian commentarial tradition, it's Jerome's version that is being commented upon, almost without exception. And it's that version that I've spent much of the last 5 years with, especially in its recent revision as the new Vulgate by the Catholic Church for liturgical purposes. There are complications that I won't go into. So I'm not talking about the Hebrew text at all. I'm talking about this Latin version, which is the central text for the Christian West. Okay, that's all preliminary. Suppose one tries to read the Song of Songs naked. I don't mean that one should oneself be unclothed while reading it, though that's always a possibility, of course. I'm thinking of reading it without external helps. What might those helps be? Well, one is reading it outside of its context within the canon of Scripture. Take it out of there, separate it from that. Another is read it without rubrics, that is, without helpful indications in the margins or elsewhere of who's talking to whom. Cheryl provided us with a couple of those in her translations, and they're often important to have, but they don't belong to the text. And if one removes rubrics like that, rubrics that tell you this is him, this is her, or other things like that, and simply reads the text from beginning to end in whatever language one is most at home in. It's a brief experience. You can read it relatively slowly in 30 or 40 minutes. You will be profoundly puzzled. That is to say, it will often be very unclear who's talking to whom. It will be very unclear why the tenses shift as they do, why the moods shift as they do. Cheryl talked about that, and in Latin it's as apparent as it is in Hebrew. You shift from present to past, you shift from imperative to indicative, you have the occasional subjunctive. The shift of voice is often not marked by gender-specific pronouns. You read it and you think, what, who, when, how, what, how, what? It's an extraordinarily puzzling phenomenon. The text is vertiginous and hallucinogenic, I would say. One is injected, reading it naked, into the world of a love lyric without names and with a great difficulty of identification. If you want analogues from popular culture, the feel of it is not so different from the feel of the standard 3-minute pop song focused on love. People typically don't get named. Passion is present. There's a shift of voice back and forth, and you often can't tell who's talking to whom or about what. And not only that, there are shifts of scene that are unexplained, and you often don't pick up that there has been one until you're 20 or 50 words into what is now obviously a new scene. I've actually done this with undergraduates, provided them with a straightforward English text and told them to sit down and read it for half an hour and then to write what it's about. And you might think that it's difficult for Christian students not to have some acquaintance with it, but if you're a Catholic, you wouldn't find that puzzling at all. They don't have really any acquaintance with it. So what you get then is all kinds of amazing things, some very creative and some just puzzled. And so reading the song naked is an experience that one ought to try, just to see what that is like and see how very strange the text is in terms of its internal features. Suppose then one reads it lightly clothed as a book of scripture. What I mean by that is returning it to its place in the canon and reading it as a book of scripture should be read, which is as resonant with the rest of the canonical collection. That, of course, can be done in many ways. There's not one right way to do that, but one way that is very prominent in the pre-modern Christian commentarial tradition, and equally prominent, I think, though differently inflected, in the Jewish commentarial tradition, is the method of what might reasonably be called word echo. That is to say, a word or a phrase occurs in the text of the song. And reading it lightly clothed as a book of scripture leads the scripturally informed reader to become aware of where else in the canon of scripture that word or that kind of phrase occurs. And thus to find the phrases or sentences of the song resonate widely. Let me just give you an example of how that might work. So if you look at the handout, you'll see that towards the bottom there are four brief translations. One of them is the same as the text that Cheryl provided, and you can compare the translation here with the one on her handout to see how mildly different things can look depending on which language you're dealing with and how you think about translation. But just to give you a couple of instances, if you're reading the very opening of the Song of Songs, let me be kissed with your mouth's kiss, and you think kiss and lips, and you are attuned to the canon of Scripture, your mind will immediately go to the other places in the canon of Scripture where kisses and lips are discussed or mentioned. And if you do that, you'll find that the connection of lips with kissing is in fact very rare in Scripture. Lips are almost always connected not with kissing but with speech, naturally enough. And so there's really only one other place in Scripture where the connection between lips and kissing is made explicit in this way. So this immediately gives it a resonant manifold which leads to a set of thoughts about how to read the text, which is quite different from reading it naked as we did in our first thought experiment. Or consider, if you look in the second extract from chapter 4, this is the hymn of praise, one of the hymns of praise that he offers to her and to her body. About 2/3 of the way through that, he says, your cheeks like a fragment of pomegranate. And again, if you were attuned to scripture, you would think pomegranates, okay. And you would think, well, pomegranates are embroidered on the high priest's robe, you would think. Or maybe you wouldn't, but if you knew that that was the case, you would think that. Again, bear in mind, I'm working only with the Latin text of the Vulgate here, so pomegranate is malum punicum, and that's the term that I'm here thinking of. You would know that pomegranate is carved into the capitals of Solomon's house. You'll know at least then immediately that the resonance of pomegranate isn't just about the beauty of her cheeks, though it certainly is about that. It's also about a symbolic representation of some material physical object that is intimate with, close to, the presence of the Lord, because both the high priest's robe and the capitals of Solomon's portico are like that. So that's another instance then of what begins to happen if you read the text of the song lightly clothed as a book of scripture. And we could do that with any one of these examples, teeth, sheep, and so forth. Much to say about all of those if one reads the book as what it is, which is a book of scripture. So that second level of reading is quite a different mode of reading, quite a different exercise. And it's a scriptural mode, and it's the standard mode, as I said, among pre-modern Christian commentators. And it's obscurely delightful, I think, would be one way to describe its results. Let me take then the third kind of reading that I mentioned before. Suppose one doesn't only read the text lightly clothed as a book of scripture, but one reads it intentionally within the context of a long tradition of its being read as a book of scripture. Not only that, one reads it in the context of an awareness of the liturgical use of the texts. Let's take an instance of how that might work, and I want to talk about the third and fourth cases I've put here on your handout. The third case from chapter 4, where the lover speaks to his beloved in these terms: "O my beloved, you are completely beautiful, and there is no stain in you." Latin, immaculata. She has no maculae, no stains. Now, from about the 9th century onwards, with increasing momentum, this text, this very text, began to be used in, probably earlier than that, we have good evidence of it from this period, began to be used in liturgical celebrations of Marian feast days of Mary. Why? Because of the word immaculata. Why because of that? Because already by then the church was thinking of Mary as Maria Immaculata, Mary without maculae, a tradition of thought that became dogmatically formalized much, much later in the 19th century when the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception was promulgated in 1854 by Pius IX. So that scriptural text began to enter into Marian liturgy, which is still one of its principal homes in the church's life today, from a very early period. And you can see it too in the increasing tendency of at least some commentators in the Latin West, when thinking about the question of, so who is the beloved that we're talking about in this text? The increasing tendency of commentators to answer that question not only in terms of the church, not only in terms of the individual soul, but also in terms of Mary. So to tie that point down a little bit, if you look at your fourth case on the handout there, I reproduced there 2 of the 3 instances of questions in the Song of Songs. So in chapter 6, verse 10, we read, "Who is she who comes out like the dawn rising, beautiful like the moon, set apart like the sun, terrible like an ordered rank from the camps?" Or in chapter 8, verse 5, who is this woman ascending from the desert, leaning on her delightful man? Under an apple tree I enlivened you. There your mother gave you birth. There your genetrix gave you birth. There's an earlier version of the question in chapter 3, but these two will do for now. What's the answer? Well, there have been three major answers to the question canvassed by the Latin West, and it's not that any one of them ever replaces the other. The three tend to work in harmony, and they are all three, conveniently and not accidentally, feminine nouns in Latin. So they are ecclesia, church, anima, soul, and Maria, Mary. And because, from a very early period, Mary is a standard figure for the church, and the church in turn a standard figure for Mary, these are symbiotic figures in a bidirectional sense. Because that's the case, the identification over time, gradually with increasing momentum, of the proper answer to this question as including Maria became increasingly prominent in the church. So now, you see, we're reading the text not only in its scriptural context, where you would be surprised to identify the beloved as Mary. We're reading it now in a gorgeously arrayed both commentarial and liturgical tradition. And I strongly think that the song, more than most scriptural texts, because of its literary features, because of its puzzling literary features with which I began, calls for, requires, and certainly provokes the kind of elaboration that I've just spoken of. It enters deeply into the life of a worshipping community, like in this case Catholic Christianity, in the ways that I've indicated, because of the possibilities of interpretation that it offers to the church. So let me conclude by noting the final point about the history of the use of the Song of Songs. If you go away and read Providentissimus Deus and Munificentissimus Deus, these are the two papal texts in which first the dogma of the Immaculate Conception and second the dogma of the Assumption, both of Mary, were promulgated, first in 1854, the second in 1950. If you go away and read those, you will discover that they are studied with texts from the Song of Songs. The first one, the Immaculate Conception document, has, by my count, 9 unmarked partial paraphrases or direct quotations of the Song of Songs in the papal text that promulgates the dogma, and the Assumption one has 6. And if you worship within the Catholic tradition, you'll find that, as I said, the principal home of these Marian parts of the song is now within the celebration of Marian feasts. So what this tells you then is that this is a particular, obviously very particular tradition of interpretation, one that wouldn't be shared by many Protestants and certainly not by Jews, but it's an instance of a much broader phenomenon, which is that the text gets injected into and increasingly clothed by successive layers of commentarial and liturgical gorgeousness, because the whole thing is unbelievably gorgeous. The more that you read in the commentarial tradition, both the beauties of the text itself and the beauties of the liturgical and commentarial use of it become apparent. So for me at least, reading and writing about this text has been, I think appropriately enough, a matter of seduction by beauty. And I recommend that to any of you who have not yet engaged in that enterprise. Thanks.
Well, I am honored to be on this panel with these great scholars, without whose work on the song I could not have done my own. It's a real pleasure to be here. My colleagues here, as you've heard, are deeply skilled linguists, and I am not. I am more what Virginia Woolf called, following Samuel Johnson, a common reader. someone who is trying to piece together from her reading, which is not as systematic as it could be, some, as Wolf says, some kind of whole, some kind to create something out of what I've been reading. The song, as we've been learning for the last day and a half, is incredibly generative in that way and has created more new poetry, more new theology, more new music, new art, new calligraphy, new creations than perhaps any other book of the Bible. So thank you, colleagues. It is good to be here with you. When I was working on my commentary on the Song of Songs, I met a woman who told me a story about the song that I will never forget. Her husband had served on a submarine in the U.S. Navy in the 1970s, and family members were allowed to send messages to the sailors, but the messages could be no more than 8 words long. The military, though, counted a Bible verse as only 1 word. So the loved ones on shore filled their messages with them. She told me that she would send messages like this: SOS, 1, 2. And her husband, deep below the surface of the ocean, would look up Song of Songs 1, 2 in the Bible. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Or SOS 4, 7. You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Or SOS 8, 7. A great message to send to a beloved submerged beneath miles of water. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. This woman had flung the words of the song into the sea like a lifeline, where they entered the submarine like a secret code. Coiled within those SOSs were so many prayers. I miss you. God be with you. Please come home. Bent over the Bible like a scholar, the sailor would search the song for the beloved's voice, and together they crossed the miles of water between them on the bridge of the Song of Songs. The lover on the shore, sending her verses of the song to the one she loves, joined a long tradition in Judaism and Christianity of making the words of the song one's own. In his first homily on the song, Origen of Alexandria advised his listeners to join with the bride in saying what she says, so that you may also hear what she heard. Joining one's voice to the voice of the woman was a way of building a bridge across a great distance, a way of opening oneself to hear God's voice in response. Join with the bride in saying what she said, so that you may also hear what she heard. For readers like Origen, the Song of Songs is a prayer. Now, I will tell you that when I speak about the song in churches, people are surprised to hear this. The song, as you know, still has a lively liturgical and devotional life in Judaism. It is sung, it is prayed, it is part of the liturgical language of the community. But it has been a long time since Christians, at least Christians outside of monasteries, have made the words of the song their own in worship or in prayer. Even Isaac Watts's hymns based on the song, as Colin Thompson showed us an hour ago in his wonderful paper, have not been printed in hymn books in a very long time. Although I think if there's a way that the song reaches Protestant Christians liturgically, it's probably through hymnody. There are lots of lilies and doves and apple trees and things in our hymns. Medieval Christians, as has often been noted, as Paul noted, commented more frequently on the Song of Songs than any other book of the Bible. For them, the Song of Songs was a fathomless pool of meaning one could swim in one's whole life long and never touch the bottom. It was a garden in which one might encounter the living God walking in the cool of the day. It was a key hidden at the heart of the Bible, capable of unlocking its secrets. It was a text to be studied, memorized, prayed over, prayed with, written on the heart of the reader. For many contemporary Protestant Christians, however, the Song of Songs is a marginalized oddity, useful as a quarry for wedding liturgies, and only certain parts of it at that. I could tell you stories about weddings. As attention moved from the hidden layers of meaning excavated in the Middle Ages to an emphasis on the historical meaning of the text in modernity, the Song of Songs became sidelined. The great American feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke for many modern Christians when she pronounced allegorical readings of the song as far-fetched and unworthy of the ideal Jesus. The Song of Songs she wrote in her women's Bible is merely a love poem by a young king to his harem. As allegorical methods and the meanings that developed out of them were rejected, and as attention shifted to the literal and the historical, readers were left with an erotic poem that left no body part uncatalogued, no taste or smell of the beloved uncelebrated, that nowhere mentioned God. Christians began to forget the song that for many of our ancestors was the very key to the Bible. These days, you would be hard-pressed to hear a sermon on the Song of Songs in a Christian church unless you were at a wedding, especially in churches that follow a lectionary. The only passage from the Song of Songs that appears in the Revised Common Lectionary, widely used by mainline Protestants, is Song 2, 8-13, the portion in which the woman sings of her lover's voice, how quickly he comes to her like a gazelle or a young stag, how he stands behind the wall of her house, gazing through the windows and the gaps in the lattice, singing of spring. This reading is offered in the Revised Common Lectionary twice, both times as an alternative reading in the Sundays of Ordinary Time, once as an alternative to the Psalm of the day and once as an alternative to the reading from the Hebrew Bible. Preachers can easily leave it unchosen. So the question that interested me when I was writing my commentary was, can the Song of Songs once again be a text of devotion for Christians? Can we still make the words of the song our own, as Origen advised? And what difference would that make in our relationship with God, or with each other, or with the world? And what practices of reading would we need to do this? Would it require us to create a consistent Christian allegorization of the text? Or could we experiment theologically with the insights of allegorical readings of the song while also keeping the song's own preoccupations always in view? The glory of the human body, the erotic possibilities of mutuality and love, the responsiveness of an environment that is cared for and cultivated, the longing to know and be known, and the many ways we remain mysteries to one another, no matter how intimate we are. So I'd like to look at one small part of the song, one half of one verse from the passage the parsimonious lectionary writers put into the Revised Common Lectionary. If the preacher did choose this text from among the choices the lectionary offers, she could use it, I believe, to open up the whole song to her congregation, to offer it as a resource for a life of devotion. The part I want to look at is the second half of verse 9 in chapter 2, in which the woman speaks. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. What would the preacher find if she looked into the allegorical readings around this text? It would depend, of course, where she looked. Hopefully she would be saturated in 2,000 years of tradition, but her reading may be more spotty than that. She would certainly find a hidden God behind that wall. And she might also find a hidden God whose vantage point on the human beings he gazes upon is often framed by the human body. The Midrash Rabbah reads the one hidden behind the wall as God consistently throughout all the readings it offers, but the meaning of the wall and the windows and the lattice multiplies as it goes along. In the accumulating images of these readings, God, though hidden, draws close to human beings. In the first interpretation, God stands behind our wall of Sinai and speaks from the mountain. But in the next, God stands behind the walls of synagogues and houses of study, looking from between the shoulders of the priests when the priests stand to pray, and peering through the fingers of the priests when they spread their hands at the recital of the blessing. God stands behind the western wall of the temple, peering through the gaps, gazing at the people through the merits of the patriarchs, which are the windows, and the merits of the matriarchs, which are the lattice. By looking through the windows of the ancestors' merits, God's view of us is shaped by expressions of human life at its most questing and courageous. And by peering through the gaps between the shoulders of the priests who stand to pray and the space between their fingers as they offer a blessing, God's view of us is framed by bodies in postures of worship, bodies that are, in a way, sacramental because they give shape to human longings that are otherwise invisible. Those bodies perhaps help God to see what is hidden inside of us, the part that is awake, to use the language of the song, even when we are asleep. Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century Cistercian monk who wrote 86 sermons on the Song of Songs and barely got past the end of the second chapter, also sees God standing behind the wall, gazing in through the windows and the latticework, a hidden watcher, as Bernard puts it, of hidden things. For Bernard, this passage has to do with the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, the idea that God lived among us in a human body, as a human being with a body as vulnerable as anyone's. There's a long tradition of Christians using the song, as you might imagine, as a way of apprehending the incarnation. 4 centuries after Bernard, Teresa of Avila will hear in the first verse of the song, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," the human longing for God to live among us. The kiss for Teresa represents the pressing of divinity into human flesh. For Bernard, though, it's the approach of the lover, bounding across the hills like a gazelle, that represents the incarnation of the Word. The wall outside of which the lover stands is the body itself, and the windows and the lattices are the human senses and feelings by which God experienced human life. Looking out on the world through those windows, Bernard interestingly claims, God learned mercy. Do you see him, Bernard writes, becoming what he was and learning what he knew, seeking in our midst openings and windows by which to search more attentively into our misfortunes. It is the body itself that tempers the judgment of God which Bernard fears. By looking out at us through the eyes of the body, God's mercy deepens. There's lots more to be said about this. He's trying to say God changes and doesn't change at the same time. And if you want to pursue this, it is Sermon 56 in Volume 3, I think, of Bernard. That's just really interesting to me. So the interpretive tradition around this verse is vast, as is the interpretive tradition of every verse of this song. But even with these few readings from the Midrash Rabbah and Bernard of Clairvaux, the preacher would have plenty of material to think with. Professor Fishbane yesterday afternoon argued for a biblical hermeneutics, setting the terms for ongoing theological inquiry, a wonderful description of the preaching task itself. The preacher could invite her congregation to consider a God hidden among us, for whom the bodies of the priests in the Midrash Rabbah and God's own body in Bernard, frames God's view of us and deepens God's sympathy for us. In this way, an allegorical reading that finds one thing in words, another in meaning, God for the lover, bodies for the window, leads us not away from the literal meaning of the song itself, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other anti-allegorists feared, but even more deeply into them. Does making the words of the song our own always require allegory, though? If you believe that the poem was written as an allegory, as some of us were talking about last night, I suppose it might. But if you see it as a poem about love or a collection of poems brilliantly redacted that somehow claimed its unique place within the biblical canon, it surely need not be allegorized in order to be prayed. The song is singing of so many things we need to understand in the present time. The reverence due the human body, a vision of the earth not as a commodity to be mastered, but as a place to make our home, what mutuality in love looks like. But even in a straightforward reading of the literal meaning of the song, there is much that is secret and hidden. Because the Song of Songs is a song about love, it is also a song about separation, hesitation, missed meetings, vulnerability, misunderstandings, and the ache of absence. The song acknowledges over and over that no matter how intimate we are with each other, it is sometimes difficult for us to find each other, meet each other, recognize each other, and know each other. We hear this in the questions the lovers keep asking each other. As I learned from Cheryl Exum's wonderful commentary, the woman, lovesick and concerned with presence, is more likely to ask, "Where are you? Why can't I find you?" The man, awestruck and overwhelmed by the woman, asks, not "Where are you?" but "Who are you?" Who is this that looks forth like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? The women of Jerusalem also ask, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved?" These questions seem to me very real questions that represent the heart of what this poem is trying to say. That no matter how intimate we are with each other, we always remain mysteries to each other. The lovers in the song are so beautiful, and the poet makes us see that beauty in all its shining glory. But the lovers are also more than their beauty, more than the sum of the glorious body parts that they each praise endlessly. And that more is difficult to comprehend and describe. Praying the Song of Songs might help us remember this, that even with those we know and love, there is always something, as Bernard of Clairvaux put it, farther out or farther in. This is why it is just as important to see the lover behind the wall as it is to see God hidden there. And this is why we need to stand there ourselves, looking through the window that is the song. Praying the song reminds us that what we cannot see and know about the other, about God, about ourselves, is as worthy of reverence and adoration as what we can see and know. When we honor what is hidden in another beyond our reach, we learn something about ourselves as well. For if even the most inaccessible parts of us can be loved, then maybe we are more than we believe ourselves to be. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our four panelists for their wonderful presentations, which I think are a wonderful sample for us of the experience and conversations we've been having in the last several days. Again, I mentioned for a purpose, the news that I mentioned at the start about the violence at the site of the marathon. I'm thinking, what better text for us to be reading than the song during a moment like this? The first of the quotes on Paul's text: "Love is strong as death. Its flames are flames of fire, an almighty fire. Floods cannot quench love, nor rivers drive it away." I think in various ways our panelists have reminded us that in today's world, in the situations in which we find ourselves, as human beings, as scholars, as teachers, as students, as members of communities, it's remarkable that the song is a text to which we go back again and again, and perhaps after this period where it has not been much commented on and not much read in churches, that there may be a new opening, that this song again is kind of becoming a universal text that speaks in all directions. I think one of the things that we have been talking about these last several days, and you can hear on the panel, is how is it that we bring together these different disciplinary, literary, historical, theological, pastoral perspectives and weave them together in a conversation where we're all better off. And I think what we can do, we have our speakers were very disciplined and gave us plenty of time between now and 6 for your comments and questions, not simply as receivers of information, but perhaps for insights that you may have into how the song is used, but also maybe questions that you can ask that can lead to more kind of crossing over, what different speakers have said, how these things can be meshed together. So I'll take the questions, but you may also direct them either to the entire panel or name one particular person. So the floor is open. Yes, please.
So this is a question for Stephanie. Regarding the difficulty that modern readers have with allegory. And I'm wondering whether it's partly because of the way in which allegory might be presented with an X for Y, a strict X for Y presentation, and that perhaps part of the solution might be in offering a variety of allegories at every moment. The same kind of thing that Professor Fishbane was talking about, where there was always always 4 options to choose from on any particular verse, and that what that might do is it might loosen the "oh come on" kind of response that people have when they see an allegory.
That's great. I think that's exactly right, Joel. I think it's consoling to think that there are multiple meanings all at once that you can hold together. And you know, there's a long tradition, obviously, in Judaism, but also in Christianity of saying, you know, Augustine's rule of charity, that if you have 2 or 10 or 20 interpretations of the same passage and they all build up the love of God and the love of neighbor, you can't say any of them are false. There's something consoling about that. I think, you know, Colin today in his paper talked about the, you know, just the sort of Enlightenment moment when the allegorical readings just started to sound strange to people. And it was so liberating and so exciting to focus on the literal historical meaning of the text, and that opened up the world in new ways for people in that moment. But I think we might be back in a moment when it's more possible to, as long as we do what you said, which is let the allegories accumulate and have, you know, I mean, I love the image of Michael's commentary with the verse in the middle and the readings accumulating around them. As long as we're clear that, you know, there are multiple allegories to move around among, I think that might be more welcome now than it once was in the 19th century when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was writing.
I think we're more allegorical than you think.
Yeah.
Or I think we continuously think spontaneously with other things in mind. And if something would be gleaned from the rabbinic tradition in this way, the question would be, where are you reading? And where do you want to go with your reading? Are you reading in a liturgical setting? Are you reading in a private meditative setting? Are you reading in the context of psychology and relationships? Are you reading in the context of other things that you've read? We carry what the ancients carry. We carry all these deep palimpsests that make allegoresis possible. We're always spontaneously reading over and under, and these things arise. I think one of these great traditions is there is a presumption of systematic and coherence, and that these things grow, and they have a certain authority. But we just have to trust ourselves. If you read within whatever you know within a liturgical tradition or an artistic tradition or any kind of tradition, things happen, and you read so that the reading of the world that you have is enlightened by the text, and the text becomes deepened by your reading of the world. So I would simply say there is something to be gained by realizing that there are traditions of allegories and there are hints, but I think we live at these multiple levels of consciousness, and the issue is how texts bring that up, and then to do it in a responsible manner if one is within this context or another.
David.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up. It's basically to Paul, but anybody can answer. I just wonder why you think there was this enormous drop in Christian commentaries and drop in Christian commentaries from the 15th century on, and what that says about sort of the shifting canon within the canon. I mean, sort of the place of the Song of Songs in the canon.
Well, that's a very large subject, and I can't speak to it in any rich way, but in the Catholic case, parts of the story are pretty clear, so that the Council of Trent, which you might think of as part of the Catholic response to the Reformation, instituted a number of reforms, including reforms of a liturgical sort, and including, therefore, reforms of the lectionary. And those reforms reduced the prominence of the song in the lectionary. That's one thing. Now, why that was the case, that's a complicated historical business. So there's that sort of particular on-the-ground sort of answer. But there's clearly another broader cultural answer, which is that for one reason or another, at least for Europeans, I suppose, there was a mixture of, first of all, a move toward or away from figural and other kinds of reading of scripture and toward historically informed readings. And that made the song less exciting. And the other thing...
Or too exciting.
Well, exciting for different reasons, anyway. Right. And then, yeah, the too exciting part is the other part of the story, which is that for Europeans, I don't know, at least for the English, I suppose, who knows, the idea that you would want to read a book about sex or about sexual desire and its fulfillment and disappointment was vaguely suspect in itself for a long time. When I was growing up as a child, the Song of Songs was a book that you read sort of secretly. You'd page through it in church when nothing else was going on, so you could find those bits. But it certainly wasn't encouraged. It wasn't that there was any... So it's only all these things together. But yeah, right. Well, that would always help. Yeah.
Other comments or questions? Yes, please. Professor Clifford.
I had a comment that might supplement what Paul said, and that is that there was a kind of tendency to a doctrinalization of Christianity as a result of the Reformation controversies, and it may well be, I just throw that out there as a possibility, that the Song of Songs that took a back seat to a focus on other texts that were more doctrinally significant for the time. I would just like to raise an issue that the Song of Songs has always sparked in me, and that is the question of mutuality and of articulateness. And it becomes more acute when I compare it to Proverbs chapter 7, where the young man at night, all by himself, is going toward a house being looked at out the window by the commentator. And he doesn't say a word, but the woman greets him, and I think you can make the case that when she invites him to the feast, there's a double meaning to the feast. It looks like it's a feast, but there's a kind of funeral quality to the language that she uses. It always struck me as extraordinarily the sharpest contrast possible to the Song of Songs, in which there's an almost equal a number of words given to both the man and the woman. I think the woman actually has a few more, but no? You would know. But anyway, I just wondered what you thought about the mutuality and articulateness as qualities that characterize the song that are not always posed in that way.
Cheryl, do you want to take that?
Was there a question in that? I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what the question was in that.
The question is, do you have any thoughts on that? That's another way
On
of saying it.
mutuality
Well,
and
mutuality and also the articulates, it seems to spark language in both, and also eloquence. And I just wondered if that has been raised in the kind of reflection, in the kind of reading that you've done, and also whether you have noticed it as a significant element.
well, I think the mutuality is a very significant part of it, and I think it's due to the dialogue format, so that you have speeches of both the man and the woman. When I said about the woman not having more speech than the man, I've not counted verses, but they both have too long speech. I mean, they both have approximately the same, and I think that you have a poet who's giving attention to both points of view, and that's quite significant. Although you have ancient Near Eastern love poetry, as you know, where you have dialogue, and especially the Egyptian poetry, both the young men and the young women speak. But the mutuality is extraordinary. What strikes me about the mutuality is there are few places where it might have been missed, such as the metaphorical descriptions. If the woman did not look at him at least once and describe him, he would be the only one looking. And we would say this is a very unmutual text. This is a male text where the male owns the gaze and looks at the female. And you can't say that because at least she looks once. At least there's this balance. There's one other thing, I can't think of right this moment, where the poet does the very same thing again, where he takes something that wouldn't be mutual, he hadn't thrown one little thing in, but I can't quite think what it is at the moment. Maybe somebody else can. Where does he ask it? Oh, in chapter 6.
Well,
Well,
it's not clear.
that would be
Right.
was the women of Jerusalem ask it when it's leading upon her lover? It has to be the women of Jerusalem. So
That
he may
text
have
is-
one in chapter 6.
Paul has the text open.
Well, I have not the text they're talking about. But I'd like to underscore one thing about the mutuality, which I thought came out beautifully in what Cheryl said, but there's an added emphasis to make, which is that because there are at least 3, maybe 4, cases where they effectively use the same formulae to address one another, it's not only that they have roughly the same number of words to address one another, but they talk to each other in the same words, so that sometimes you're not sure, and indeed the text, at least the Latin text, is sometimes unclear as to who is saying this, and the reader has no clear sense. That's deep mutuality, because it means that although there are, I think you're right, different patterns in the male and female speech, there are these cases where it's not clear enough who's speaking, and where it's possible to make a judgment either way.
They're in the Hebrew. I think there are very few places where.
But there are some, though.
There are some.
Right.
There are
So the fact that that's possible, and the fact that there are these formulae which are on both lips, deepens mutuality, I think.
And they do speak with similar metaphors sometimes.
Right,
to the others.
right.
So
And they build on their metaphor. I mean, they kind of hand their metaphors back and forth and change them a little bit, like I am a lily of the valleys. Then he says, a lily among brambles. Then she says, an apple tree in the wood. You know, they're making the poem together, and that's another sign of the mutuality.
Michael, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I would just pick up in terms of what Richard raised in terms of Proverbs 5 of 7. There's a variety of terms that are very similar to the love language of the Song of Songs. And this may be another way that you, Stephanie, can use texts like this for liturgical purpose. That is to say, you have texts that function as diptychs, psychological and emotional diptychs. So if you place aspects of the song over against 5 and 7 in Proverbs, you have the way the same language and desire is used and misused.
Right.
Deceit as opposed to encouragement. The kind of seduction use of language or the lie that's used when the same term can be used as a form of mutuality.
Yep.
And I think that is another way that from the internal scriptural point of view, without even having to go to the allegorical, you can create psychological and spiritual diptychs, say, on how people meet and speak, and how people deceive with the same language, and that the way it's focused in a specific way is
You've been waiting.
go to the whole tradition to.
Yes, I'd like to kind of follow up with Professor Fishbane's notion of spiritual exercise, but particularly what are the uses? The Song of Songs is embedded in the Jewish liturgy. So could you perhaps tell us a little about how it works for the Kabbalat Shabbat? And there's another holiday, which I can't, Pesach, that we read it as a community, which explains why the Song of Songs is not forgotten among Jews.
Well, I was first trying to suggest that the very reading process is a spiritual exercise. The slowing down of reading to phrases, the slowing down of reading to words, so that words then become resonant with other words within Scripture, but within the depths of tradition. So it becomes a slow, reflective reading, and then within the perspective of the Pardes, or the fourfold model, you're within a very deep prismatics. Now, if we were simply to take a text, one of the ways that the Song of Songs comes in the entrance of the Shabbat liturgy of Lecha Dodi, and others that appear, is these are deeply Kabbalistic texts that require one to meditate, let us say, on the fallenness of the world, the upbuilding of the world, the return of God to a level of holiness. A text like that has deeply encoded Kabbalistic levels. Some of those have been studied in very intense ways. But that's a text for a certain form of recitation. The same way as Alkabetz's Yedid Nefesh, which is also recited in some context in the beginning of the Sabbath, but most likely in the third meal, which is the traditional occasion for it, is an encoding of the divine name, and around the divine name, innumerable phrases from the Song of Songs, in which one tries to internalize and personalize that spiritual message. So I think there are some cases where these are liturgical celebrations or desires of the soul that are placed within a certain kind of context. What I really had in mind for spiritual exercises is the way that the soul becomes reflective in a slow manner in and through the tradition, and moves through these words so that the self is in a contemplative frame of mind. These other occasions, like you did Nefesh or Lecha Dodi, or there are many other places where that is done, or the way in liturgical poetry those are added into the service of the Passover service. Those are forms of pedagogical celebration, or they're dealing with certain motifs, and that would be different from what the spiritual exercise is, where a person becomes responsible for their personal life, and they try to encode language of the tradition so that it becomes a depth language that resonates in different kinds of ways. That's more of what I had in mind.
Question, yes, over here.
I assume that the Mishnah had little or nothing to say about the Song of Songs, but was there anything in the Talmud that tells us reflection on the Song of Songs?
Well, the Mishnah already does have quite a bit to say.
Oh, okay,
And it even
I'm
has
wrong.
The first allegorical reading of the Song of Songs. But particularly, the Mishnah deals with whether the song is like other books and it defiles the hands, and it can be included in Scripture, in the canon. And then you have the famous statement of Rabbi Akiva that if all the other books are holy, the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. So there are already deep reflections that it's not only acceptable as a sacred book, but it's a book of very particular quality. And then in the Tosefta, which is also a sentence that appears also in the Talmud, something that had been referred to earlier, I think, during the scholarly discussions, but if one trills Menanea, if one recites the Song of Songs the way one would sing erotic songs in a bar, then one has trivialized the song and one has no share in the world to come. So it's quite clear that there's a whole tradition that's been counteracted, that people were actually rapping the Song of Songs because it was powerful erotic poetry. And the stand of Rabbi Akiva and others for various reasons saw in this a deep liturgical reading. So you have a cultural polemic going on. And then the third voice already in the Mishnah is already that this is the giving of the law at Sinai.
Joel, again?
Just wanted to just to add one comment to this gentleman's question about the use
Of Song of Songs for liturgy on Friday afternoon is that the Song of Songs itself is read on Friday afternoons in both in Hasidic communities and in Sephardic communities. And you can find it there in the liturgy. Though when one goes to their synagogues, or when one goes to synagogues in which people are traditionally supposed to be reading it, they are reading it very, very quickly, if they're there yet at all. Yes, that's right.
Other comments, questions? Anyone who wants to jump in who hasn't jumped in yet? Okay.
Cheryl Exum, you commented on the shifting use of tenses, giving the illusion of a kind of ever-present quality. And Paul Griffiths, you commented on the vertiginous aspect of the shifting of tenses and persons. And I was wondering to what extent these things might be results of our point of view. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, the use of tenses isn't what it is to us today. Are those kinds of issues perhaps a result of our modern point of view compared to what it meant in its time or something like that? That's the kind of question.
I don't think so, because they've always perplexed all the commentators of when is this happening, and there are these amazing jumps. They're in the king's chambers, and then they seem to be shepherds, and then they seem to be somewhere else. And I think the important thing to remember is that the shifts in time and the shifts in space, they're both quite dramatic. They can be come with me from Lebanon. How did she get to Lebanon and so forth? It's a poem. It's really not a description of real things happening in the lives of real people. And so, and it's a lyric poem. So the poet feels, I think, quite free to imaginatively shift a lover to the peaks of Lebanon for a moment. And also, I think this shifting in time, it's often difficult to tell. They're always speaking, she's telling a story. So when she speaks about love, she's telling stories. But the way she tells them, you feel like she's speaking, as you read it, you feel like she's speaking directly to you, or directly to the women of Jerusalem, if you want to be more literal. And what she's saying seems to be happening at the moment. When she says, listen and look, he's coming, it's this impression that you get with these tenses. And then she says, he said. So commentators find it very difficult to sort of disentangle sometimes. Is she recounting something that happened? Is it supposed to be happening now, and so forth? I think the shifting is really the poet's way of keeping love always in progress, making sure that it seems to be happening. When the man is knocking, or seems to be knocking at, well, there's no door, but he's knocking.
There is a door at one point.
Where? Oh. Well, anyway. It seems to be happening in the present, and she goes out searching, and I'd have to look at the text again, but you just can't, it's very, very hard to say. She addresses the watchman immediately, have you seen my lover, as though she's talking to them, but she seemed to be telling a story. And then where does her story end? And she starts speaking to the women of Jerusalem. It's just this movement that's amazing.
I think that's exactly right. And the index of it is that if you look in the Latin tradition at the multiple attempts to figure out how to divide the text and how to decide who's talking when to whom, you'll see that there are so many of those and they're not the same. And so there are internal complexities with the text that lead to that. So it's puzzling in a good way from the beginning. It's not just our point of view that makes it that.
Marilyn, did you have a?
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you. And I've just been fascinated by everything that's been said over the past couple of days. And one of the things that was the idea of the echo of words, and I had noticed in the songs and in Genesis there seems to be a similarity in the Latin anyway. Exactly, ubi pascas is what the beloved asks. Where are you grazing? And Joseph in Genesis 37 is saying, I'm seeking my brothers, indicem mihi, ubi pascant gregas, and the beloved is saying in the Song of Songs, indicem mihi, ubi pascas, and it's he's betrayed and sold into bondage, and with her question, she's liberated and redeemed, and so I don't know. It's just I was just wondering if Professor Fishbane, if you had a comment on that. In the Judaic tradition, is there anything written about that, or if anyone else has a comment on that?
Not on that particular.
On that particular verse, but
The use of the grazing is used in the Midrashic tradition to understand. Echat tir'eh is how do you providentially care for God in the exile. It's a different form of caring. But there are other ways that term comes in, but it's not necessarily linked in that episode.
So I think we have come to the end. You can see how extraordinary it is. Everybody's getting their books out and people are reading the text. The natural next step, had we time, would be to break up into groups and read the song together. So I think that's a great promise, and that perhaps we can find a way to do that sometime. But for now, we must call our session to an end, and let us thank our panelists.